April 10, 2003, the joint press statement from British Airways and Air France has already gone out. Both airlines, speaking in careful, coordinated language, announced that Concorde will be retired by the end of October. Falling passenger demand, rising maintenance costs, a mutual decision taken together for commercial reasons. That is the official story. But here is what makes no sense. The airline that signed that statement was, at that very moment, banking £50 million in profit from Concorde's final 6 months of operation. Lord Marshall of Knightsbridge, chairman of British Airways, did not wait long to contradict the script his own airline had just released. He told The Times that British Airways had been forced into retirement because Air France and Airbus refused to continue supporting the aircraft. He said directly that BA would have been keen to continue operating Concorde beyond October if the French side had been willing to share the maintenance burden. He said Airbus had been determined to redeploy the staff who supported Concorde to more profitable production lines. The joint announcement, he made clear, was not a joint decision. So the real question this video answers is not why Concorde stopped flying. It is who actually made that call, when they made it, and why nobody outside a boardroom was ever supposed to know. British Airways generated a cumulative after-tax profit of £500 million from Concorde operations across its years of service, using just 7 aircraft. That figure alone overturns the dominant narrative. The aircraft that the world remembers as a financial catastrophe was, for the airline that operated it best, a machine that quietly printed money for 2 decades. To understand why that fact matters, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. In November 1962, the governments of the United Kingdom and France signed a formal treaty to jointly build the world's first commercial supersonic passenger aircraft. The project was unprecedented in scale and ambition. It was not a partnership between companies. It was a treaty between nations, with penalty clauses for withdrawal, underwritten by public money, driven by the desire of 2 declining imperial powers to demonstrate that European engineering could still lead the world. The original cost estimate was £150 million. By the time Concorde entered service, the bill had reached £1.3 billion, shared between the 2 governments. Every other airline that had placed an option on the aircraft, and at peak interest that included Pan American, TWA, Japan Airlines, Qantas, and more than a dozen others representing over 100 provisional orders, had canceled by the mid-1970s. The oil crisis of 1973 made a fuel-hungry supersonic aircraft commercially indefensible overnight. The manufacturers were left with 2 customers, British Airways and Air France. On January 21, 1976, at 11:40 in the morning, 2 Concordes lifted off simultaneously. One from London Heathrow, bound for Bahrain. One from Paris, Charles de Gaulle, bound for Rio de Janeiro via Dakar. The moment was broadcast live on television. It was by every measure the most dramatic aviation event since the first transatlantic crossing. What those passengers were sitting inside was not merely a fast aircraft. It was a flying experiment in what the relationship between time and distance might become. Concorde cruised at Mach 2.04, 1,354 miles per hour, at altitudes approaching 60,000 feet. At that height, the curvature of the Earth is visible. The sky above shifts from blue to a deeper violet. A Boeing 747 of the same era cruised 20,000 feet below, through weather and turbulence, taking 7 hours or more to cover the same transatlantic distance that Concorde compressed into under 3.5. Passengers could board in London after breakfast and land in New York before the American morning had even begun. That speed made Concorde into something the aviation industry had never produced before, a product sold entirely on time. Not comfort, not price, not route network, time. The specific human beings who valued that proposition most were investment bankers, corporate executives, celebrities, and heads of state for whom a 5-hour gap on a subsonic aircraft was not an inconvenience, but a competitive liability. On July 13, 1985, Phil Collins performed at Live Aid in London, boarded a Concorde, crossed the Atlantic, and appeared on stage in Philadelphia on the same day. No other technology in the world made that possible. The economics took years to stabilize. British Airways operated at a loss through its first 6 years with the aircraft. But after the airline restructured Concorde's commercial model, repositioning the service explicitly as a luxury product and pushing fares accordingly, profitability followed. By 1983, BA recorded its first Concorde profit of £14 million. By 1987, that had grown to £54 million. By the year 2000, immediately before events intervened, annual profits from the fleet were approaching £60 million, from 7 aircraft flying a single route. No comparable asset in the history of commercial aviation generated returns at that ratio. Air France never matched that performance. The French carrier lacked British Airways' aggressive commercial approach, and from the 1990s onward, was operating Concorde largely as a statement of national prestige rather than a profit-generating enterprise. But for BA, the aircraft was not a liability, it was the crown jewel. And then, on a July afternoon in 2000, a piece of metal the size of a small ruler, dropped by a different airline's jet minutes earlier, ended all of it. 40 of Concorde's most loyal repeat passengers, people who flew the aircraft a minimum of 20 times a year, worked in the World Trade Center and died on the morning of September 11, 2001. Concorde did not just lose a market that morning, it lost the specific human beings who were its market. To understand how it came to that, the sequence of events has to be followed from the beginning. At 16:42 on July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 accelerated down runway 26, right at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. The passengers on board were 100 German tourists, most of them charter customers headed to New York to board a cruise ship. 5 minutes earlier, Continental Airlines Flight 55, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 headed to Newark, had taken off from the same runway and shed a titanium wear strip from its number 3 engine cowl door. The strip was 435 millimeters long, less than 2 centimeters wide, and had been improperly installed using the wrong alloy during maintenance in Tel Aviv 6 weeks earlier. It lay on the runway, invisible to anyone. The Concorde's number 2 tire struck it at speed. A 4.5-kilogram chunk of rubber tore away and slammed into the underside of the wing at an estimated 310 miles per hour. The shockwave it created ruptured the tank from within. Fuel sprayed. An electrical arc in the landing gear wiring ignited it. The fire that witnesses photographed from the ground was already there before the aircraft left the ground. The crew climbed to 200 feet and could go no further. 90 seconds after the start of the takeoff roll, Concorde FBTSC hit a small hotel in the Paris suburb of Gonesse. 113 people died. Both fleets were grounded that same afternoon. What followed was not a token response. British Airways committed to a comprehensive safety modification program. Kevlar liners were bonded into the fuel tanks. Michelin's new near-zero growth tires replaced the older pneumatic type on all 8 main landing gear wheels, and the electrical wiring throughout the undercarriage bay was armored against arc ignition. Air France conducted the minimum modifications required for recertification and did not go further. That distinction mattered, and it would define the 2 airlines' very different fates after the return to service. By September 5, 2001, British and French civil aviation authorities had returned the certificate of airworthiness to the modified aircraft. Operational assessment flights resumed. Concorde G Boaf, the last production aircraft ever built, flew its first post-modification passenger flight on September 11, 2001. It landed at Heathrow before noon, while the crew and passengers were still on the ground. The World Trade Center was being destroyed in real time. The effect on Concorde was compound and specific. The entire aviation industry suffered, but Concorde suffered something the rest of the industry did not. Its entire customer base was concentrated in a single profession, in a single city, in a single district. Wall Street bankers and financial executives who crossed the Atlantic 6, 8, 10 times a year on Concorde were the aircraft's core revenue. A significant portion of them worked in the towers. Those who survived were no longer traveling. In the months after the attacks, Air France was filling barely a fifth of the seats on its 5 aircraft and was operating every flight at a structural loss. British Airways was in a better position, but not by enough. Normal commercial services had resumed on November 7, 2001, when Concorde flew into a New York that was still in mourning, welcomed at JFK by then Mayor Rudy Giuliani. But the premium transatlantic travel market that Concorde's economics depended upon did not recover. BA had rebuilt the plane. BA had refurbished the cabins. BA was turning a profit again. And then Airbus made a phone call. Airbus refused to transfer the Concorde type certificate to any other company, meaning that even if Richard Branson had purchased every aircraft at full market value, not a single one could have legally left the ground. That was the mechanism. That was the lock. To understand how a manufacturer came to hold that power, the corporate structure has to be traced back to July 10, 2000. That was the date Aerospatiale Matra, the French state-owned company that had built Concorde's airframe, merged with Germany's Daimler-Chrysler Aerospace and Spain's CASA to form the European Aeronautic Defense and Space Company, known as EADS, which was the direct predecessor of the organization now called Airbus. With that merger, the Concorde Type Certificate, the legal document that defined the aircraft's design standards and authorized its continued operation, passed from a French state company into the hands of a new commercially driven pan-European corporation, answerable to shareholders. Aerospatiale had been able to absorb the cost of Concorde support as a matter of national prestige. EADS had no such obligation. It had a balance sheet and investors to satisfy. By early 2003, Airbus informed British Airways privately that it intended to redeploy the engineering staff who supported Concorde to more commercially productive programs. It told BA that keeping Concorde flying through 2008 would require a further £40 million in maintenance expenditure. And it said, without ambiguity, that it would not support Concorde operations by any airline beyond October 2003. Not British Airways, not Air France, not anyone. British Airways went directly to Airbus with a proposal to take over full independent support, to assume all maintenance responsibilities, and keep the aircraft flying without manufacturer backing. The answer was no. Airbus would not transfer the type certificate. Without the type certificate holder's active participation, the civil aviation regulators in both Britain and France had no legal basis to maintain the airworthiness certificates that permitted commercial flight. The aircraft could not fly. Richard Branson, who had announced his intention to buy the entire British Airways fleet the morning after the April 10th retirement announcement, escalated his offer from £1 per aircraft to £1 million, and then to £5 million per aircraft. A British Airways spokesperson replied, in terms drawn directly from Airbus's position, that Concorde would not fly commercially again because the manufacturer would not support its continued use under any operator. The Trade and Industry Secretary at the time, Patricia Hewitt, declined to intervene. The British government could find no legal obligation compelling Airbus to maintain the fleet. Branson cited the original 1962 Anglo-French Treaty. There was no such clause. The last scheduled British Airways passenger service from New York to London departed on October 24, 2003. The last flight of any Concorde anywhere, G-BOF from Heathrow to Bristol-Filton, took place on November 26, 2003. Within a few years, the simulators used to train Concorde pilots had been decommissioned. The engineers who held the aircraft's technical knowledge had dispersed or retired, and the spare parts inventory had dissolved. In 2009, Airbus SAS formally surrendered the Concorde Type Certificate. Every aircraft sitting in a museum anywhere in the world became permanently grounded at that moment, not by age, not by structural failure, but by a legal formality in a regulatory office. The machines exist. The knowledge to operate them, in any certified sense, does not. Today, Boom Supersonic holds 130 orders and pre-options for its Overture aircraft from United Airlines, American Airlines, and Japan Airlines. The company's XB-1 demonstrator broke the sound barrier over the Mojave Desert in January 2025. If Overture reaches commercial service, it will be the first passenger aircraft to fly supersonically since Concorde's last flight. 20 years later, a company called Boom Supersonic has 130 orders from United Airlines, American Airlines, and Japan Airlines. And the question the industry still cannot answer is whether Airbus grounded supersonic travel for a decade or for a generation. The most advanced passenger aircraft ever built wasn't defeated by physics or economics or a crash. It was defeated by a clause in a contract that nobody outside a boardroom was ever supposed to read. That is what the Concorde story actually is. Stripped of the nostalgia and the commemorative documentaries and the footage of crowds weeping at Heathrow in October 2003, it is not a story about an aircraft that flew too fast for its time, or too expensively, or too dangerously. British Airways was generating profit from Concorde's final 6 months of operation, while simultaneously announcing that the aircraft was commercially unviable. The machine was not broken. The institutional will to continue was what had been withdrawn, quietly, by a manufacturer with a balance sheet to protect, and a product line that Concorde was complicating. What the story proves is something broader than aviation. It proves that the question of whether a technology survives is rarely a question about the technology. It is a question about who holds the paperwork and what they stand to gain by letting go of it. Concorde was the only profit-making supersonic passenger jet in the history of commercial aviation, and the entity that controlled its legal right to fly decided, for reasons it never fully disclosed, that the world would not be flying supersonically anymore. The aircraft did not run out of sky. The institutions ran out of interest.